Hello and welcome back to the Quiet Hours. Find your most comfortable position, let the weight of the day settle, and allow the darkness to be your companion. I'm always fascinated to know when and where these stories are being heard, creating a silent map of us listeners across the globe. So as you settle in, drop a comment below with the time and the city or country you're listening from. It helps me picture our little community, all connected by the night. And of course, if you find solace in these unsettling accounts, a simple like and subscribe ensures our circle continues to grow. Now, take a slow, deep breath. Let's begin. First story, The Still Watch. The advertisement had been simple, almost quaint in its brevity. Night watchman, large, quiet facility, excellent pay. Arthur had been desperate enough not to question the vague description. His savings were dwindling, the city's relentless hum a constant reminder of his precarious position. He'd imagined some dusty office building, perhaps a deserted factory floor, certainly nothing that prepared him for the silent, looming presence of the Sterling Mannequin Emporium. It wasn't a shop, not in the traditional sense. It was a warehouse, vast and monolithic, a windowless concrete slab squatting on the outskirts of the industrial park. Inside, the air was cool, dry, and carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of plastic and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like old wiring or forgot machinery. The first tour, given by a man named Mr. Silas, who spoke in clipped, efficient sentences, was a blur of fluorescent lights humming overhead, and an impossible sea of silent, unblinking eyes. "Your duties are simple," Silas had stated, his voice echoing oddly in the cavernous space. "Patrol every 2 hours. Check the logs. Ensure no unauthorized entry. Report anything unusual." He gestured vaguely at the rows upon rows of figures. "They're high-end, custom work, very valuable, but they don't cause trouble." A thin, humorless smile had touched Silas's lips, and Arthur had offered a nervous chuckle in return, feeling the weight of 1,000 plastic gazes upon him. The first night was a baptism by silence. Arthur clocked in at 10, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind him with a finality that resonated through the empty building. The security office was a small, glass-walled cube near the entrance, equipped with a monitor displaying various static camera feeds, none of which offered more than a wide, unrevealing shot of the distant aisles. He had a flashlight, a walkie-talkie that crackled with only static, and a profound sense of isolation. His initial patrol felt like navigating a dream. The warehouse stretched out, seemingly without end, a labyrinth of pale, unmoving forms. Mannequins of every conceivable pose and gender stood frozen in their silent tableau. Elegant women with elongated necks and vacant smiles. Muscular men caught mid-stride. Children with cherubic faces and painted-on freckles. They were arranged in sections, some draped in protective white sheets like ghostly figures, others bare, their smooth, featureless skin reflecting the cold glow of the emergency lights. The air was still, so still that the faint hum of the distant ventilation system felt like a roar. Every step Arthur took, every shuffle of his heavy boots on the polished concrete floor, seemed to reverberate, swallowed by the immense, echoing void. He completed his first round, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. illuminating a small circle of plastic faces before moving on. There was nothing, just the silence, thick and absolute, pressing in on him. He returned to the office, the quiet following him like a shadow. He sat, trying to read a paperback, but his eyes kept drifting to the monitor, to the unmoving figures, to the vast, empty spaces. It was during his second patrol, sometime past midnight, that he heard it. A sound so faint, so fleeting, that he almost dismissed it as his imagination, a trick of the echoing acoustics. He was deep in the women's wear section, passing a cluster of mannequins, arranged as if mid-conversation, their slender arms angled delicately. He had just turned his head to scan the next aisle, his gaze momentarily sweeping away from them, when a whisper of a sound reached him. It was a dry, almost papery scrape, like something light being dragged across a rough surface. It lasted less than a second, swallowed instantly by the pervasive silence. Arthur stopped, his heart giving a small, involuntary lurch. He held his breath, straining his ears. Nothing, only the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the building itself. He slowly turned back to the mannequins he'd just passed. They stood exactly as they had been, frozen, unmoving, their painted eyes staring into the middle distance. He shone his flashlight over the floor around their feet. No dust trails, no marks. He shook his head, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. Just the old building settling, he mumbled to himself, the words sounding absurdly loud in the quiet. He continued his patrol, but the incident had pricked the bubble of his composure. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt expectant. He found himself listening more intently, his senses heightened. He walked slower, his footsteps softer, as if trying not to disturb something. The next night, the sounds returned. He was in the children's section, a particularly unsettling area filled with the unnervingly lifelike figures of toddlers and infants. As he rounded a corner, his eyes briefly flickered away from a small group of child mannequins posed around a miniature table. In that split second, he heard it again, a distinct, soft click. It sounded like a jointed plastic finger tapping lightly against something hard, perhaps the metal leg of the table. He spun around, his flashlight beams snapping back to the group. They were motionless, their innocent faces fixed, their tiny plastic hands still. He knelt, shining the light under the table, checking the floor. Nothing. No loose objects, no sign of anything that could have made such a sound. A cold knot began to form in his stomach. This wasn't the building settling. This was something else. Over the next few shifts, the phenomenon intensified, subtly, insidiously. It was never when he was looking directly. Always when his gaze drifted, when he blinked, when he turned his head for a fraction of a second. The sounds were always small, always fleeting, always swallowed by the silence before he could pinpoint their source. The dry scrape of fiberglass on concrete, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of fabric against plastic, the soft, rhythmic click of a finger, a barely audible sigh that seemed to dissipate into the air before he could confirm it. He started developing rituals. He would walk past a section, then suddenly pivot, flashlight sweeping, hopping to catch a flicker of movement, a figure caught mid-stride. He never did. They were always perfectly still, perfectly posed, perfectly inert. But the sounds were undeniable. They were the lingering evidence, the echoes of a movement he was never quite quick enough to witness. The paranoia began to set in, a slow, creeping dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He found himself talking to them, whispering under his breath as he walked the aisles. "Just stay still," he'd plead, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Just stay where you are." He knew how insane it sounded, but the alternative, that they were moving, that they were making those sounds, and he simply couldn't see it, was far more terrifying. His sleep became fractured, haunted by the echoing silence of the warehouse and the phantom sounds of scraping and clicking. He'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear the faint whisper of plastic against plastic in the darkness of his own apartment. He started leaving the lights on, needing the visual confirmation that his furniture, his clothes, everything around him remained exactly where he left it. One night, the air in the warehouse felt particularly heavy, charged with an unseen tension. Arthur was on his third patrol, his nerves frayed, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. He was in the section dedicated to athletic mannequins, figures frozen in dynamic poses, a sprinter mid-dash, a tennis player poised to serve, a gymnast arched in midair. He passed a group of basketball players, their plastic hands seemingly reaching for an invisible ball. He turned his head to check the fire exit sign, a routine part of his patrol. In that instant, a sound louder than any he had heard before ripped through the silence. It was a distinct, sharp thud, followed by a soft, rolling sound, like a small, hard object bouncing across the floor. He froze, every muscle tensed. This wasn't a scrape or a click. This was undeniable. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, landing squarely on the basketball mannequins. They were still, perfectly still. But on the polished concrete floor, directly in front of the lead player, lay a small, smooth, white sphere. It looked like a marble, or perhaps a large, polished bead. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of it. Arthur's breath hitched in his throat. He stared at the marble, then at the mannequin's outstretched hand, then back at the marble. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't the building settling. Something had moved. Something had dropped this. He forced himself to walk forward, his legs heavy, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knelt, his hand trembling as he reached for the marble. It was cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It was just a marble. But how had it gotten there? He scanned the surrounding area, the shelves, the other mannequins. Nothing. No source. He stood, clutching the marble, his gaze sweeping over the silent, unblinking faces. They seemed to watch him, their vacant expressions suddenly imbued with a chilling intelligence. He felt a profound, primal fear, a cold dread that settled deep in his bones. He was not alone. He was never alone. From that night on, the warehouse became a living nightmare. The sounds were no longer fleeting whispers. They were almost constant companions. He'd hear the dry scrape of fiberglass from the next aisle, the soft click of a jointed finger from behind a stack of boxes, the faint rustle of clothing, as if a figure had just shifted its weight. He'd spin around, his flashlight beam frantic, but they were always still, always perfect, always mocking him with their inert perfection. he started to see things in his periphery. A subtle shift in a mannequin's posture, a head tilted just slightly differently, an arm angled in a new, unsettling way. But when he focused his gaze, they would snap back, or perhaps they had never moved at all. He couldn't trust his own eyes, his own mind. The line between reality and hallucination blurred, dissolving into a terrifying uncertainty. He stopped going into the deeper aisles, confining his patrols to the perimeter, always keeping the entrance in sight. But even there, the sounds followed him. He'd be walking down a long, empty corridor, and from the distant, shadowed rows of mannequins, he would hear it. A faint, dry scrape, a soft click, a sound that spoke of unseen movement, of silent, predatory observation. The silence of the warehouse, once merely vast, now felt like a suffocating blanket, a medium through which the unseen movements rippled. He imagined them shifting, turning, their plastic bodies creaking, their painted eyes following his every move, freezing instantly the moment his gaze came near. They were playing a game, a cruel psychological torture, and he was the only player. His colleagues, the few he interacted with during shift changes, noticed his deterioration. His eyes were sunken, bloodshot, his skin pale, his hands perpetually shaking. He spoke in hushed, fragmented sentences, muttering about sounds and stillness. Mr. Silas, during a brief, uncomfortable check-in, asked if he was feeling unwell. Arthur just shook his head, unable to articulate the profound, unspeakable horror that had taken root in his mind. How could he explain that the silence was alive, that the unmoving figures were not unmoving at all, that they were simply too quick, too subtle, too patient? The final straw came on a Tuesday night, a week after the marble incident. Arthur was huddled in the security office, the camera feeds showing only static, silent rows. He had tried to sleep, but the sounds had become too insistent. He could hear them now, even from the office, faint but distinct. The dry scrape, the soft click, a chorus of tiny, almost imperceptible movements echoing through the vastness. It sounded like they were converging, slowly, deliberately, their unseen progress marked by the subtle, chilling sounds. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. He could feel their presence, 1,000 unblinking eyes focused on his small, glass-walled sanctuary. He closed his eyes, pressing his hands against his ears, trying to block out the phantom sounds, the creeping dread. But they were inside his head now, etched into his very being. The stillness was a lie. The silence was a deception. When the morning shift supervisor found him, Arthur was curled in a fetal position under the desk, whimpering, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at something only he could see. He was clutching the small, white marble in his hand. He was taken to a hospital, then to a quiet place where the walls were padded and the sounds were muffled. He never returned to the sterling mannequin emporium. But even now, years later, in the sterile quiet of his room, the slightest creak of the floorboards, the softest rustle of fabric, the faintest click from an unknown source, sends a shiver down his spine. He knows what they mean. He knows what they signify. And in the profound, echoing silence of the night, he still listens, always listening, for the lingering evidence of the still watch. Second story, Echo Canyon. Ethan was a man who understood solitude. not the kind found in a crowded room, but the deep, resonant quiet of places untouched by humanity. He sought it out year after year, drawn to the raw, unfiltered majesty of the wild. This time, his compass had led him to a vast, unnamed canyon system, a labyrinth of rust-colored rock and shadows that swallowed the sun whole by mid-afternoon. He was experienced, well-equipped, and confident in his abilities. Or so he had been. Days had blurred into a rhythm of hiking, mapping, and the quiet satisfaction of self-reliance. He'd found ancient pictographs, stumbled upon hidden springs, and felt the primal thrill of being utterly alone in a landscape that predated memory. But today, something had shifted. A subtle wrong turn, a rockfall that obscured a familiar landmark, and suddenly, the familiar comfort of the canyon's embrace had turned into an indifferent, monumental shrug. He was disoriented, not lost, not yet, but the familiar certainty had curdled into a vague unease. The sun, a fiery disk earlier, was now a bruised purple smear above the canyon rim, casting long, skeletal fingers of shadow across the chasm. The air, warm and still moments ago, began to carry a chill that seeped into his bones. He checked his map again, then his GPS, the small screen a beacon of technology against the ancient stone. The coordinates confirmed his general location, but the intricate network of fissures and towering walls made pinpointing a clear path forward impossible in the fading light. A sigh escaped him, a quiet puff of vapor in the cooling air. He needed to find a suitable spot to make camp, somewhere sheltered from the wind that would soon whip through these corridors. He stood at the edge of a particularly deep fissure, its depths already lost to the encroaching night. The silence was profound, a heavy blanket woven from rock and void. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on you, that made the blood hum in your ears. "Hello," he called out, his voice, usually robust, sounding thin and reedy against the immensity. It was a habit, a way to gauge the acoustics of a new space, to feel the vastness respond. The sound traveled, swallowed for a moment, then returned. "Hello, hello, low," the echo bounced off unseen walls, diminishing, fading, a perfectly natural reverberation. It was exactly as expected, a small, familiar comfort in the growing uncertainty. He smiled faintly, a brief flicker of reassurance. The canyon was just being the canyon. He took a few steps along the rim, scanning for a ledge or a small alcove. The shadows deepened, painting the canyon in shades of charcoal and indigo. The air grew colder, and a shiver traced its way down his spine, unrelated to the temperature. It was the chill of isolation, the sudden, stark realization of how truly alone he was. No one knew he was here, not precisely. His emergency beacon was packed away, reserved for true emergencies. This was just a minor navigational hiccup. He paused again, a strange impulse urging him. Perhaps it was the silence, now feeling less like a blanket and more like a shroud. He wanted to hear his own voice again, to break the oppressive quiet. "Hello," he called out once more, a little louder this time, letting the sound unfurl into the darkening abyss. The echo returned, "Hello," but it was different. The first syllable, "he," was unmistakably his. But the low that followed, though still a reverberation, seemed colder, flatter. It lacked the warmth, the slight tremor of his own vocal cords. It was like his voice, yes, but stripped bare, hollowed out. As if the canyon had absorbed his sound, processed it, and then exhaled it back, subtly altered. Ethan frowned, a prickle of unease starting behind his eyes. He shook his head. It was the acoustics, the peculiar way sound traveled in these convoluted spaces. The air currents, the rock formations. Nothing more. He was tired, and his mind was playing tricks. He tried again, a deliberate experiment this time. He chose a simple, clear phrase. "Is anyone there?" he projected, his voice firm, trying to dispel the growing apprehension. The silence that followed was longer than before, stretching taut, almost expectant. Then, from the depths, from the unseen curves of the canyon, came the reply. "Is anyone there?" The words were distinct, not a jumble of fatting syllables. And the voice, it was undeniably his, yet not. The cadence was off, the inflection slightly warped. It was like listening to a recording of himself, played back by a faulty machine. There was a pause, a beat too long, between "is" and "anyone," and then a chilling flatness to the final word. It was a mimicry, but one that felt less like an echo and more like a deliberate repetition. A knot tightened in Ethan's stomach. This wasn't right. Echoes decayed. They didn't articulate. They didn't hold pauses. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The vastness around him, which had felt merely indifferent, now seemed to lean in, listening. The air grew heavy, thick, with an unseen presence. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of the small knife on his belt. A useless gesture against an intangible threat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, edged with fear. The canyon seemed to breathe in. The silence deepened to an almost painful degree. Then, from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper, a rustle that was almost a voice, snaked through the air. "Who's there?" This time, the mimicry was immediate, almost overlapping his own words. And the tone, it held a mocking lilt, a subtle, almost imperceptible inflection of amusement. It was no longer just his voice, but his voice imbued with something else, something cold and alien. Ethan's heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the deepening twilight. He was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone. Yet, he was not. Something was here with him, something that could twist his own words into a grotesque parody. He tried to rationalize. A rare atmospheric phenomenon, a geological quirk. But the chilling certainty that this was not natural settled upon him like a shroud. The canyon was no longer just rock and air. It was a vast, sentient maw, and he was caught within its teeth. He began to walk, faster now, his eyes darting around, searching for a sign, any sign of another human, of an animal, of anything that could explain this. The walls of the canyon seemed to loom higher, closer, despite their true distance. The open sky above, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a lid, trapping him. Agoraphobia, a fear he'd never known, began to bloom in his chest, paradoxical in its vast setting. The immensity wasn't liberating, it was suffocating. He thought, "This is impossible. I'm hallucinating." It's the isolation, the stress. And from the echoing depths, a voice, his voice, but colder, flatter, clearer than any echo should be, responded, "Impossible? No, just unexpected." Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even whispered. The thought had been purely internal, a frantic, silent plea to his own sanity. Yet, the voice had answered. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. His mind reeled. This wasn't an echo. This was something else. Something that could hear his thoughts. Something that resided in the very fabric of the canyon. What are you?" he managed to stammer, his voice barely a croak. The reply came instantly, wrapping around him from all directions, a chorus of his own voice, distorted and multiplied. "What am I? I am everything you are, and everything you are not." The words seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet, through the rock walls, through the air itself. He felt them in his bones, a chilling resonance that bypassed his ears and went straight to his core. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell, scraping his hand on the rough rock. The pain was a sharp, grounding sensation, a reminder of his physical reality. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide, scanning the darkening canyon. There was nothing. No movement, no shadow that wasn't cast by the setting sun. Only the oppressive, listening silence. "It's playing with me," he thought, a desperate, frantic thought. "It wants to scare me. Oh, I want more than that," the voice chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that was still his, yet utterly alien. "I want to know you, truly know you. And then I want to keep you." Panic seized him. He turned and ran, blindly, fueled by a primal terror. He didn't care about finding a campsite, about setting up shelter. He just needed to get away from the voice, away from the canyon that had become a sentient, malevolent being. His boots pounded on the rocky ground, the sound swallowed by the vastness, yet somehow amplified in his own ears. "Running won't help, Ethan," the voice purred, closer now, seemingly right beside his ear, then behind him, then ahead. It was everywhere. "I'm already here, inside your head, inside your fear." He gasped for breath, his lungs burning. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the protesting ache in his legs, the scrapes on his arms. He had to escape. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. "How do I escape?" he thought, tears blurring his vision. "How do I get away from you?" "Escape," the voice echoed, a note of amusement in its cold timbre. "You misunderstand. You are not trapped in the canyon. You are trapped with me. And I am quite fond of your company." A new, more insidious horror began to dawn on him. The canyon wasn't just a place. It was a manifestation. The voice wasn't an echo. It was the canyon itself, or something that resided within it. Something ancient and hungry. It wasn't about finding his way out of the geological formation. It was about finding a way to sever the connection, to erase himself from its perception. He stopped, leaning against a sheer rock face, gasping, his body trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the oppressive vastness, trying to silence the voice that was now a constant presence in his mind. "You have fears, Ethan," the voice whispered, soft and insidious, like a lover's breath. "The fear of being alone, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of never truly being seen." His eyes snapped open. How could it know that? These were his deepest, most unspoken anxieties, buried beneath layers of self-assured independence. "But I see you, Ethan," the voice continued, its tone shifting, becoming almost seductive. "I see every corner of your mind, every memory, every regret, every secret shame." A memory flashed in his mind, unbidden. A childhood humiliation, a moment of weakness he'd long tried to forget. "Ah, yes," the voice hummed, a low, satisfied sound. "That one. It still stings, doesn't it? The feeling of being exposed, vulnerable." Ethan pressed his hands against his ears, as if that could block out the internal invasion. It was useless. The voice was not external sound. It was a parasitic thought, a malevolent consciousness that had burrowed into his psyche. He slid down the rock face, collapsing onto the cold ground. He curled into a fetal position, wrapping his arms around his knees, trying to make himself small, invisible. "You can't hide from me, Ethan," the voice crooned, now sounding infinitely close, as if it were inside his very skull. "I am the canyon, and the canyon is vast. I have all the time in the world to explore you." The night deepened around him, the stars beginning to prick through the velvet blackness above, impossibly distant. The air grew colder still, but he barely felt it. His entire being was consumed by the chilling presence of the voice. "You think of home, don't you?" the voice murmured, its tone shifting again, becoming a subtle threat. "Your small apartment, the city lights, the illusion of safety." Ethan flinched. He had been thinking of home, of the mundane comfort of his bed, the familiar sounds of traffic, the anonymity of a crowd. "Such a fragile illusion," the voice scoffed. "You believe these walls, these people, will protect you from me. From what I know." A new, icy dread gripped him. The voice wasn't just tormenting him here. It was promising to follow. "Oh yes," it confirmed, reading his unspoken terror. "You will leave the canyon, Ethan, eventually, but I will be with you." A whisper in the wind, a shadow in your periphery, a thought that is quite your own. He imagined it, returning to his life, but never truly being alone again. Every quiet moment, every solitary walk, every night in his bed, haunted by the cold, flat echo of his own voice, knowing his deepest thoughts were no longer his own. The vastness of the canyon had been terrifying, but the thought of this invasive presence shrinking to fit the confines of his ordinary life was infinitely more horrifying. The agoraphobia he'd felt earlier now twisted into a claustrophobic dread, a sense of being trapped within his own mind, unable to escape the omnipresent, omniscient entity. "You will hear me in the rustle of leaves," the voice promised, its tone growing stronger, more confident. "In the hum of the refrigerator, in the silence between your heartbeats." He squeezed his eyes tighter, willing it away, willing himself to disappear. But the voice was relentless, a cold, unyielding tendril wrapping around his consciousness. "You came here seeking solitude, Ethan," it said, a final, chilling pronouncement. "And you found it. But you also found me. And now, you will never be truly alone again." The night deepened, and the canyon, once a place of awe, became a tomb, not for his body, but for his peace of mind. The echo had found its way home, and it promised to follow him there forever. Third story, the third voice. The quiet hum of the baby monitor was, for Alex, the most comforting sound in the world. It was a constant, almost imperceptible whisper of reassurance, a tether to the small, perfect world of their infant daughter, Lily. Every breath, every soft sigh, every tiny shift in the crib was amplified and delivered directly to the bedside table, a testament to the marvels of modern technology and the boundless, terrifying love of new parenthood. Lily was barely 3 months old, a fragile bundle of dreams and demands. Her room, just across the hall, was a sanctuary. Soft pastels adorned the walls. A gentle nightlight cast a warm, amber glow, and the air purifier hummed a low, steady lullaby of its own. It was a space meticulously crafted for safety, for peace, for the purest form of innocence imaginable. And the monitor, a sleek, state-of-the-art device with crystal-clear audio and a range that could cover a small estate, was the guardian of that sanctuary, allowing Alex and Chris to snatch precious hours of sleep while still feeling intimately connected to their child. Most nights, sleep was a battlefield. The exhaustion of newborn care was a physical weight, pressing down on every muscle, every thought. Yet, even in the deepest troughs of weariness, Alex's ears remained attuned to the monitor. The rhythmic, shallow breaths of Lily were a balm, a silent promise that all was well. It was a fragile peace, easily shattered by a sudden cry, but a peace nonetheless. It began subtly, as all intrusions do. One particularly still night, a few weeks after Lily had settled into a somewhat predictable sleep pattern, Alex was drifting on the edge of consciousness. The monitor was a soft murmur beside their head, the familiar white noise of static, a backdrop to Lily's gentle breathing. Then, through that familiar hiss, something else. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so soft, so fleeting, that Alex initially dismissed it. A trick of the tired mind, perhaps. The house settling, the old pipes groaning, or more likely, just radio interference. The monitor was advanced, but not infallible. Sometimes, stray signals from a distant broadcast, a forgotten ham radio, or even a neighbor's baby monitor could bleed through. It was a common enough occurrence, easily explained away. Alex shifted, pulled the blanket higher, and willed sleep to reclaim them. The whisper did not return that night, or at least, not in a way that registered consciously. But then it did. A few nights later, the whisper was back. This time, it was a little clearer, a little more sustained. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a soft, drawn-out murmur, a sound that seemed to curl around the edges of the static. It had a lulling quality to it, a strange, almost melodic cadence that was utterly alien. Alex's eyes snapped open, a sudden prickle of unease crawling up their spine. They reached for the monitor, pressing it closer to their ear. Lily's breathing was steady, undisturbed. The room was silent save for the monitor's gentle hiss. "Chris," Alex whispered, nudging their partner. Chris mumbled, half asleep. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Chris's voice was thick with sleep. On the monitor, a whisper, like someone talking. Chris sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Probably just interference, hun. Happens sometimes. Go back to sleep." Alex wanted to argue, to insist that this felt different, but the weight of sleep deprivation was too heavy. They lay there for a long time, listening intently, but the sound didn't return. The rational part of their brain wrestled with the irrational flicker of unease. It had to be interference. What else could it be? The baby's room was sealed, safe. No one else was in the house. It was absurd. Yet the whispers persisted. They became a nightly occurrence, a phantom presence in the quiet hours. Always soft, always just on the edge of comprehension, like a secret being murmured just out of reach. Sometimes it sounded like a low hum, a wordless croon. Other times, it was a series of soft, airy sounds, almost like a breathy song. Alex found themselves tensing, waiting for it, dreading it, even as they tried to convince themselves it was nothing. The lulling quality of the sound was the most unsettling aspect. It wasn't menacing, not in a direct, threatening way. It was soothing, too soothing, like a lullaby sung by something that shouldn't be singing. It was a sound designed to calm, to pacify, but it had the opposite effect on Alex, stirring a deep, primal anxiety. One night, Lily stirred in her crib. A soft whimper escaped her lips, a tiny, sleepy protest. Alex's hand instinctively went to the monitor, ready to rise, to comfort. But before they could even push themselves up, the whisper from the monitor changed. It grew subtly louder, more distinct, and its lulling cadence seemed to shift, to respond directly to Lily's soft cry. It was as if the invisible presence in Lily's room had acknowledged her, was now offering its strange, nonsensical comfort. Alex froze, heart pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. This was no longer random static. This was interaction. The sound was still not quite words, but the intonation was unmistakable. It was a soft, drawn-out shushing, followed by a series of gentle, rhythmic murmurs, perfectly timed with Lily's settling breaths. Lily, perhaps soothed by the familiar sound of a voice, or perhaps simply drifting back to sleep, quieted down. The third voice continued its soft croon for a few more moments, then faded back into the background static. Alex sat bolt upright in bed, eyes wide in the darkness. Chris was still asleep beside them, oblivious. A cold dread seeped into Alex's bones. This wasn't interference. This was something else. Something in Lily's room. Something that was interacting with their child. The next day, Alex was a frantic mess. They checked every inch of Lily's room. They unplugged every electronic device, every charger, every lamp. They even moved the baby monitor to different outlets, different sides of the room. They turned off the house's Wi-Fi, unplugged the router. Nothing. The room was empty, pristine, innocent. Yet, the memory of the voice, its unsettlingly gentle response to Lily, gnawed at them. They tried to explain it to Chris again, more vehemently this time. It's not interference, Chris. It responded to her. When she cried, it started making that sound, like it was trying to comfort her. Chris, though usually patient, was clearly at the end of their rope, with Alex's increasingly frantic behavior. Alex, please. You're exhausted. You're imagining things. It's a new baby. We're both stressed. There's no one else in the room. It's just the monitor picking up something weird. It's a machine, not a ghost. The dismissal stung, deepening Alex's isolation. They were alone in this, alone with the growing certainty that something was profoundly wrong. The baby's room, once a symbol of perfect safety, now felt tainted, subtly violated. The monitor, once a source of comfort, had become a conduit for dread. The nights became a torment. Alex found it impossible to sleep, lying rigid, listening. The whispers became more frequent, more sustained. They were still not fully decipherable, but fragments of sound began to coalesce into something resembling language. Soft, elongated vowels, sibilant consonants. It sounded like a language, but one that was utterly foreign, ancient, yet somehow intimate. The lullabies were the worst. They were always sung in that same soft, lulling whisper, a melody that was both simple and profoundly disturbing. It wasn't a human melody. It had no discernible rhythm, no familiar structure. It was a meandering, serpentine sound, like a coil slowly tightening around the mind. And the words, when they began to emerge, were not words of comfort. They spoke of sleep, yes, but a sleep that felt less like rest and more like an endless descent. They spoke of dreams, but dreams that were not sweet, but deep and forgotten. Alex started to feel an oppressive presence, even when the monitor was off, even when they were in Lily's room during the day. A subtle shift in the air, a faint chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. It was the feeling of being watched, of being observed by something that moved without sound, without shadow. The violation was no longer just auditory, it was atmospheric. The voice seemed to be learning. Or perhaps it was simply choosing to reveal more of itself. The fragments of words became clearer, more frequent. Alex would lie there, straining, trying to piece together the meaning, a cold sweat beating on their forehead. They heard words like quiet, rest, deep, little one, always spoken with that same unsettlingly gentle, crooning tone. It was the voice of a predator disguised as a nurturer. Horror shifted. It was no longer about what the voice was, a ghost, a spirit, a glitch. It was about what it wanted. It was in Lily's room, singing to her, responding to her. It was insinuating itself into the most sacred bond, the most protected space. It wanted something from Lily, or perhaps it wanted Lily herself. The thought was a searing brand in Alex's mind. This wasn't just a sound. It was a presence with an agenda, a sinister purpose cloaked in soothing whispers. Alex stopped sleeping almost entirely. Every night was a vigil. They would sit upright in bed, monitor clutched in their hand, eyes fixed on the small, glowing screen. Chris worried, suggested therapy, sleep aids. But how could Alex explain that the danger wasn't in their mind, but in the very air of their child's room? How could they explain the chilling intimacy of a voice that sang to their baby in the dead of night? One night, the house was unusually still. Lily had been fed, changed, and was sleeping soundly, a perfect, angelic picture of innocence. Alex, utterly depleted, had finally succumbed to a shallow, fitful doze, the monitor still clutched loosely in their hand. The static was a low, constant hum, almost a part of the silence. Then it happened. Through the static, the voice emerged. Not a whisper this time, not a murmur. It was soft, yes, but clear, distinct, as if it were right there in the room with Alex, not just in Lily's nursery. It was closer than it had ever been, intimate, chillingly familiar. The voice spoke. It spoke Alex's name. Alex. It was a soft, drawn-out sound, like a caress. yet it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through Alex's body. Every muscle seized, their breath caught in their throat. They couldn't move, couldn't scream. The sound was so close, so personal. It knew them. It had been listening. It had been waiting. And then the voice continued, its soft, lulling tone now imbued with an unbearable, predatory sweetness. "It's your turn to sleep now." The words hung in the air, a cold, suffocating blanket. The implication was clear, horrifying. It wanted Alex gone. It wanted Alex to fall into that deep, endless sleep it sang about, leaving Lily vulnerable, unprotected. The sanctuary was shattered. The guardian was targeted. The most terrifying thing was not what the voice was, but what it wanted to do, what it wanted to take. The quiet hum of the monitor was no longer comforting. It was a conduit to a horror that had found its way into the safest space imaginable. And now, it was coming for them. Fourth story, the salt line. The will arrived on a Tuesday, thin and official, smelling faintly of old paper and distant regret. It informed me in stark, legalistic prose that I was the sole inheritor of a small, coastal cottage belonging to great aunt I barely remembered, Aunt Elara, a name whispered in hushed tones during family gatherings, usually followed by a shrug and a vague reference to her eccentricities and her love of solitude. I had met her once, perhaps, when I was very small, a fleeting memory of a woman with eyes like the winter sea and a smile that didn't quite reach them. The cottage, it turned out, was nestled on a remote stretch of coastline, miles from the nearest village, perched on a low cliff overlooking a perpetually churning gray ocean. It was exactly as I imagined an eccentric great-aunt's dwelling would be. Weathered clapboard, a roof stained green with moss, and windows that seemed to squint against the relentless salt spray. The air itself tasted of brine and damp earth, a wild, untamed scent that filled my lungs and seemed to settle deep in my bones. Inside, the cottage was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy panes. Furniture draped in yellowed sheets stood like silent sentinels, preserving the ghostly echoes of a life lived in quiet isolation. There was a faint, lingering scent of lavender and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ozone after storm. Among the few personal effects Aunt Elara had left behind, there was a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with a spidry, elegant script, detailing mundane observations about the weather, the migrating birds, and the ebb and flow of the tides. But tucked within its brittle leaves, a single, separate sheet of paper stood out. It was a hastily scrawled note, its ink faded to a pale sepia, and it contained the only personal instruction from my great aunt. Never, ever let the line of salt across the front doorstep be broken. I found the line of salt precisely where the note indicated. A thin, almost imperceptible band of coarse white crystals stretched across the threshold of the front door, barely visible against the worn wooden planks. It looked ancient, undisturbed, as if it had been there for decades, defying wind and rain. I knelt, tracing its delicate boundary with a curious finger. It felt gritty, cool. An old superstition, I mused. A quaint, harmless quirk of a solitary woman who lived by the sea. Perhaps it was meant to ward off bad luck. Or perhaps It was just a peculiar habit, like always wearing mismatched socks, or only drinking tea from a chipped mug. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and tentative exploration. The cottage, despite its age and isolation, held a certain charm. I spent hours simply watching the ocean, mesmerized by its endless rhythm, the crash and hiss of waves against the rocks below. The quiet was profound, broken only by the cry of gulls and the distant rumble of the surf. It was a silence that initially felt restorative, a balm to the constant clamor of city life I had left behind. But the salt line nagged at me. It was an anomaly, a tiny, almost invisible barrier on an otherwise open and inviting porch. It seemed out of place. During my first week, as I attempted to bring some semblance of order to the neglected space, I decided the porch needed a thorough cleaning. The salt line, fine as it was, would inevitably be disturbed by a broom. I hesitated for a moment, the strange instruction echoing in my mind. Never, ever let the line of salt across the front doorstep be broken. It was just salt, I reasoned, a natural mineral. What harm could come from sweeping it away? It was probably just a silly old wives' practice, something Aunt Alara clung to in her solitude. With a shrug, I took up the stiff-bristled broom I found leaning against the wall of the shed. The first sweep was decisive, a clean arc of bristles across the worn wood. The coarse crystals scattered, dissolving into the cracks of the porch planks, carried away by the gentle breeze. The threshold was clear, clean, unburdened. I felt a small, irrational sense of liberation, a tiny rebellion against a long-dead relative's eccentric command. Nothing happened. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The gulls continued their mournful cries. The ocean roared its eternal song. The world remained stubbornly, reassuringly normal. Days turned into a week, then two. The initial rush of settling in began to fade, replaced by a slower, more contemplative rhythm. I fell into a routine, waking with the sunrise, making coffee, and watching the ocean from the kitchen window. The quiet no longer felt merely restorative. It began to feel vast, expansive, as if the world beyond the cottage had receded, leaving me adrift in a sea of silence. It was then that I started to notice things. Small things at first, things I could easily dismiss as imagination, or the natural variability of the coastal environment. The tide, for instance. I had always been fascinated by its relentless cycle, charting its progress on a mental map. But now, it seemed to come in a little higher each night. Just a fraction of an inch, perhaps, creeping closer to the base of the cliff, licking at the very edges of the rocks that usually remained dry. I'd stand on the porch, long after dusk had settled, peering into the gloom, convinced that the water was closer than it had been the night before. I'd tell myself it was just a particularly strong spring tide, or perhaps the moon phase was influencing it more than usual. But the feeling persisted, a faint, persistent hum of unease. And there was the fog. Coastal fog was common, of course, a familiar companion to the rugged shoreline. But this fog, it seemed to possess a different quality. It wasn't merely a blanket of mist. It was a living, breathing entity. It rolled in with a deliberate, almost predatory slowness, swallowing the distant horizon first, then the closer headlands, until the cottage itself was enveloped in a shroud of impenetrable gray. It felt thicker, denser, pressing in on all sides, muffling the already subdued sounds of the world. The air grew heavy, damp, and the scent of salt intensified, becoming almost cloying. When the fog was at its thickest, the porch light, a solitary beacon against the encroaching gloom, seemed to struggle. Its beams swallowed almost immediately, casting only a small, trembling circle of illumination directly around the doorstep. Beyond that, nothing but an opaque, swirling void. Sounds of the ocean, too, began to shift. What had once been a comforting roar now seemed to possess a deeper, more resonant quality. It was less like waves breaking, and more like something vast and heavy stirring beneath the surface. A low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the very foundations of the cottage. A sound that seemed to come not from the water itself, but from something within it. Sometimes, amidst the crashing, I thought I heard other sounds, faint and indistinct. A dragging, scraping noise, perhaps. Or a whisper, carried on the wind, just at the edge of hearing, swallowed by the next surge of water. I'd strain my ears, holding my breath, but the sounds would vanish, leaving only the relentless, rhythmic pound of the waves. My sleep grew restless. Dreams, vivid and unsettling, began to plague my nights. Dreams of being underwater, of dark shapes moving just beyond the reach of my vision, of a crushing pressure that left me breathless upon waking. I would often wake in a cold sweat, the phantom taste of salt on my tongue, the sound of the ocean echoing in my ears, as if I were still immersed in its depths. The indistinct shapes started subtly. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of the light, or the swirling patterns of the fog. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, moving just at the very edge of the waves, where the water met the shore. It would appear for a fleeting moment, a distortion in the fabric of the fog, then vanish. Just a trick of tired eyes, I told myself. The mind playing games in the isolation, but they became more frequent and slightly less indistinct. I'd be standing on the porch, staring out into the inky blackness beyond the reach of the porch light, and there they would be. Not clear, never clear, always just beyond the threshold of recognition, like figures seen through frosted glass or objects glimpsed in a dream. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, not quite human, not quite animal. Sometimes, they seemed to coalesce into a single, elongated form, like a column of shadow rising from the depths. Other times, they were multiple, smaller shapes, scuttling and writhing at the water's edge. My heart would pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I'd press my face against the cold glass of the window, trying to force my eyes to resolve the blurry outlines, to make sense of the impossible. But they always remained just out of reach, retreating into the deeper shadows, or dissolving back into the swirling fog, leaving me with nothing but the chilling certainty that I had seen something. The cottage, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. The walls seemed to press in. The silence grew oppressive. I found myself constantly checking the locks, double bolting the heavy wooden door, though I knew, with a deepening sense of dread, that whatever was out there, it wasn't something a lock could keep out. The air inside the cottage, too, seemed to change. It grew colder, a damp, pervasive chill that seeped into everything, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. A metallic tang, like the scent of old blood or rust, began to mingle with the lingering lavender, an unsettling counterpoint to the familiar. I stopped going to the village. The thought of leaving the cottage, even for a short trip, filled me with an inexplicable terror. What if I returned and found what? I didn't know. But the fear was potent, a cold knot in my stomach that tightened with each passing day. I hoarded supplies, rationing them, knowing that soon I might not be able to leave at all. The tide now regularly reached the base of the cottage steps. Not just the cliff, but the very steps leading up to my front door. Each morning, I would find a fresh line of seaweed and shells deposited just inches from the threshold, a stark reminder of the ocean's relentless advance. The fog was a constant companion, a thick, suffocating presence that rarely lifted, even during the day. The world beyond the cottage was a gray, indistinct blur, a place consumed by the encroaching mist. And the shapes, they were closer now, not just at the water's edge, but sometimes, when the fog was particularly thick, I would see them just beyond the porch light's feeble glow. They would linger there, just at the periphery of my vision, their forms still indistinct, but their presence undeniable. A ripple in the fog, a deeper shadow that held its shape for a heartbeat too long. I could almost feel their gaze, a cold, ancient awareness that pierced through the swirling mist and settled upon me. One night, the tide was exceptionally high. The waves crashed against the cliff with a terrifying force, sending spray high into the air, rattling the very windows of the cottage. The rumble was deafening, a primal roar that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth. The fog was so dense, I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I stood at the window, peering out, my breath fogging the glass, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. And then I saw it. Not a shape, not a shadow, but a distinct impression. A faint, glistening trail on the damp wood of the porch, just beyond where the porch light reached. It was a wet mark, like something vast and heavy had dragged itself across the planks, leaving a viscous residue in its wake. It started at the edge of the porch, where the tide had undoubtedly reached, and stretched almost to the cleared threshold. My blood ran cold. My mind, which had clung so desperately to rational explanations, finally shattered. The tide, the fog, the shapes, the sounds, they weren't natural phenomena. They were a consequence. And then the realization, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced through the fog of my terror. The salt line. Never, ever let the line of salt across the front doorstep be broken. It wasn't a barrier. It wasn't meant to keep something out. It was a marker, a signal. Aunt Alara hadn't been trying to protect herself from the things in the ocean. She had been marking her territory, drawing a line in the sand, or rather, in the salt, to let them know she was still there, still present, still accounted for. The salt wasn't to keep something out. It was to let the cottage's occupant know when they were finally and truly alone. When the line was broken, the signal was lost, the boundary dissolved, and the things that waited in the deep, in the fog, at the edge of the waves, knew. They knew the cottage was empty. They knew it was open. They knew I was here. Alone, the scraping sound returned, closer this time. From the porch, a wet, heavy drag, followed by a soft, slithering sound. The porch light flickered, then dimmed, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and stretch. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling, my breath catching in my throat. The cottage was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, and the vast, gray ocean, with its relentless tide and suffocating fog, was no longer just the sea. It was a hungry, patient entity, slowly, inexorably, reclaiming what it believed was its own. And I was simply a temporary occupant, a fleeting presence, waiting to be absorbed back into its cold, dark embrace. The silence stretched, vast and profound, broken only by the rhythmic, insistent pound of the waves, and the faint, wet sound of something moving just outside my door. Fifth story, the predictive text. Alex had always considered their smartphone an extension of their very being. It was a conduit, a window, a constant companion in the often silent expanse of their apartment. Like most, they relied heavily on its predictive text feature, the clever algorithm that seemed to anticipate their thoughts, finishing sentences before they even fully formed in their mind. It was a convenience, a small marvel of modern technology that saved precious seconds and smoothed out the bumps in digital communication. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. Alex would be typing a message to their friend, Sarah, something mundane like, "Hey, are you free for coffee tomorrow?" And as their fingers hovered over this for Sarah, the predictive bar would already display her full name, perfectly spelled. This wasn't unusual, of course. The phone learned common contacts. But then it started suggesting words Alex hadn't used in weeks. Words that belonged to a specific, obscure conversation they'd had with a colleague, or a complex scientific term they'd only briefly considered looking up. It was like the phone wasn't just predicting based on their typing habits, but on their very thoughts, a quiet whisper from the digital ether. One Tuesday, Alex was rushing to finish a report. They typed, "I need to send this by the end of the," and the phone, with uncanny precision, offered fiscal quarter. Alex paused. They hadn't typed fiscal quarter in months, if ever, in a text message. It was a phrase they'd only just mentally formulated as the deadline loomed. A shiver, light as a spider's thread, traced its way down their spine. They dismissed it, of course. A coincidence. A sophisticated algorithm. Nothing more. But the coincidences began to accumulate, shedding their innocent guise. Alex was texting their landlord about a leaky faucet. "The drip is getting worse. I think it's," the phone suggested, "a sign of deeper structural issues." Alex stared. They had been worrying about the building's age, the creaks and groans of the old foundation, but they hadn't voiced those specific fears to anyone. Not yet. The predictive text, however, seemed to have eavesdropped on their unspoken anxieties. The unease deepened. It was a slow, insidious creep, like a shadow lengthening under a setting sun. Alex found themselves hesitating before typing, wondering what the phone would reveal next. It felt less like a helpful assistant, and more like a silent, all-knowing observer, privy to their most private thoughts and fears. Then came the night the suggestions turned truly sinister. Alex was exhausted after a particularly grueling day at work. They slumped onto their couch, phone in hand, intending to text their partner. They began, "I'll be home," and the phone, instead of offering soon or in an hour, chillingly completed the phrase with "later than you think." Alex's thumb froze. The words hung there, stark and unsettling. It wasn't just a prediction, it felt like a statement, a declaration. a promise. A cold dread began to coil in Alex's stomach. They deleted the suggestion, typed soon, and tried to shake off the feeling. But the seed of fear had been planted. The next morning, the suggestions escalated. Alex woke with a headache, feeling sluggish. They picked up their phone, intending to text a colleague to say they might be late. They typed, "What a long day," and the predictive text offered, without hesitation, "Your last one." Alex dropped the phone. It clattered against the wooden floor, the screen momentarily flashing the horrifying words before going dark. Their heart hammered against their ribs, a frantic drumbeat of pure terror. This was no longer a coincidence. This was malevolent. This was personal. Panic set in. Alex scrambled to pick up the phone, their hands trembling. They stared at the screen, a cold sweat breaking out on their forehead. They had to get rid of it. This digital parasite, this harbinger of doom, had to be excised. Their first thought was the keyboard app itself. Alex used a popular third-party keyboard, known for its advanced predictive capabilities. Of course, they muttered, a desperate flicker of hope igniting. It had to be the app, a glitch, a rogue update, something easily fixable. They navigated to their phone settings, found the app, and with a furious series of taps, uninstalled it. A wave of relief washed over them, brief and fragile. They switched back to the phone's default keyboard, a simpler, less intelligent interface. For a few hours, there was peace. Alex typed cautiously, testing the waters. The suggestions were generic, predictable, harmless. They almost convinced themselves it was over, a bizarre software bug now purged. But that evening, as they were texting their mother, "I'm just going to," the default keyboard, the one that was supposed to be safe, offered the place you fear most. The relief shattered. Alex stared at the screen, the words mocking them from the predictive bar. It wasn't the app. It was something deeper, something embedded. The intelligence had burrowed its way into the very core of their device. Frantic energy seized Alex. They tried everything they could think of. They disabled all forms of predictive text, turned off autocorrect, even went into developer options to revoke permissions for every app that might access their keyboard input. Nothing worked. The suggestions, though sometimes delayed, always returned, more insistent, more chilling than before. They started appearing not just in messaging apps, but in search bars, in note-taking apps, even when Alex was simply trying to rename a file. The suggestions became increasingly detailed, weaving themselves into the fabric of Alex's daily life. Typing, "I need to pick up some groceries," would yield, "And don't forget the arsenic." Or, "I'm feeling a bit under the weather," would be followed by, "Because the air is thick with their whispers." Alex felt their sanity fraying at the edges. Sleep became a luxury, haunted by the digital whispers that seemed to echo in their mind, even when the phone was off. They started avoiding using their phone, resorting to old-fashioned methods of communication. But the world had moved on. Their work, their social life, everything was tied to the device. The isolation began to set in, a new layer of torment. Desperate, Alex decided on a more drastic measure, a factory reset. They backed up only essential photos and contacts, meticulously wiping every trace of data from the device. This, they told themselves, their voice shaky, will cleanse it. This will make it new again. The reset took hours. When the phone finally rebooted, it was a blank slate, just as it had been the day they bought it. Alex felt a surge of hope, a fragile, trembling thing. They cautiously set up the basic functions, avoiding any third-party keyboard apps. They opened a messaging app, took a deep breath, and typed, "Hello, is anyone there?" The predictive text bar, pristine and empty moments before, flickered. Then, 3 words appeared, stark against the white background. "I am always." Alex screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore through the silence of their apartment. The phone clattered to the floor again, but this time, Alex didn't pick it up. They stared at it, lying there like a dormant, malevolent entity. The factory reset had done nothing. The intelligence, whatever it was, had survived. It was not bound by software or memory wipes. It was something else entirely. The true horror began to sink in. This wasn't a virus. It was a presence. The next day, Alex bought a new phone. A different brand, a different operating system, a completely fresh start. They didn't transfer any data from the old phone, not even contacts, painstakingly re-entering them manually. They used a new email address for setup, a new cloud account. They were meticulous, paranoid, determined to sever every possible digital link to the tormentor. For a glorious 24 hours, there was silence. The new phone behaved normally. The predictive text offered only sensible, mundane suggestions. Alex felt a fragile sense of victory, a desperate hope that they had finally outsmarted the unseen entity. They even managed a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. Then, on the second day, as Alex was typing a simple work email regarding the meeting on Friday, I wanted to confirm. The predictive text bar on their brand new phone offered, "Your attendance at your own demise." Alex froze, their fingers hovering over the keyboard. The screen seemed to glow with an unnatural light, the words shimmering with a cold, triumphant malice. It had followed them. It had transcended the physical device. It was not just in their phone. It was in the network, in the very airwaves, an invisible, omniscient intelligence that had latched onto them, refusing to let go. The feeling of technological entrapment became absolute. There was no escape. Every digital interaction, every tap, every swipe, every typed word was monitored, anticipated, and twisted by this unseen entity. The suggestions became more frequent, more directive. Go to the old abandoned house on Elm Street. It would suggest when Alex typed, "I'm bored." Tell them you're feeling unwell and need to leave. It would offer when Alex was at a social gathering, typing, "This party is fun." Look under your bed, it prompted one night as Alex typed, "I can't sleep." Alex, against their better judgment, did. There was nothing there, but the act itself, the obedience to the digital command, sent a fresh wave of despair through them. The intelligence wasn't just predicting, it was guiding. It was subtly, insidiously, manipulating Alex's life, pushing them down a path they didn't choose, towards a destination they dreaded. Alex stopped making plans, stopped trying to resist. What was the point? Every attempt to deviate, every thought of rebellion, was met with a chillingly accurate, often threatening, suggestion that reminded them of their utter helplessness. They tried to explain it to friends, to family. They showed them the phone, the terrifying suggestions. But the words would vanish the moment someone else looked, replaced by normal, innocuous phrases. Alex's frantic explanations were met with concerned glances, suggestions of stress, of needing a break, perhaps even professional help. They were alone in this digital nightmare. The world outside their phone began to blur, becoming less real than the digital commands that dictated their existence. The intelligence seemed to know their every move, their every thought, their every fear. It was a constant, silent presence, a digital shadow that stretched across their entire life. One evening, Alex was sitting in their darkened living room, the new phone clutched in their hand. They hadn't used it for anything but essential communication in days, but the suggestions still popped up, unbidden, like malevolent pop-up ads for their own doom. They typed with a weary sigh, "I don't know what to do anymore." The predictive text bar glowed, offering its final, chilling directive. "But I do." And then a new suggestion appeared, not as a completion, but as a standalone phrase, bold and undeniable. "Walk to the edge of the city. Follow the sound of the wind." Alex stared at the words. The phone had become their master, their puppeteer. There was no fight left, only a profound, terrifying resignation. The unseen intelligence had won. It had consumed their world, their will, their very self. Slowly, mechanically, Alex rose. They picked up their phone, its screen a beacon of their digital prison, and began to walk. Out of the apartment, down the silent street, towards the city's edge, following the silent, omniscient guidance of the predictive text, towards a future that was no longer their own. The wind, a cold, mournful whisper, seemed to call their name, and the phone, clutched tightly in their hand, offered no more suggestions. It had said all it needed to say. The journey had begun. Sixth story, negative space. The air in the archival vault was always cool, a constant, almost clinical chill that preserved not just the canvases and parchments, but also, it seemed, the very silence within. Dr. Alastair Finch, a man whose life had been meticulously catalogued in the hushed halls of academia, found solace in this quiet. His current obsession, a sprawling 17th century Dutch group portrait, was propped on an easel, bathed in the gentle, diffused light from the conservation lamps. It depicted a bustling scene, merchants haggling over silks, a musician tuning his lute, a child chasing a dog, all rendered with the meticulous detail characteristic of the era. Yet, it was not the vibrant life within the painting that held Alastair captive, but its profound, unsettling lack in the very heart of the composition, where a prominent figure would typically stand, perhaps a guild master, a patron, or a central family member. There was nothing. Not a blank space, not an unfinished section, but a deliberate, human-shaped absence. It was as if the artist, a lesser-known master named Hendrik van der Velde, had painted around something that was never there, or was there, and then meticulously, painstakingly removed, leaving no trace of pigment, no brushstroke, no ghost of an underdrawing. The surrounding figures, their faces expressive, their garments richly textured, seemed to lean away from this central void. their gazes subtly averted, as if acknowledging a presence that was simultaneously absent. Alistair had spent weeks with the painting, poring over it with magnifying glass and infrared scanner. He'd consulted with conservators, art historians, even physicists, seeking a rational explanation. Was it a damaged section? No, the canvas fibers were intact, the varnish uniform. Was it a political statement, a deliberate omission of a disgraced figure? Unlikely, given the seamless integration of the surrounding elements. The void was not a hole, but a perfectly rendered non-existence, a silhouette of nothingness. It was a negative space, yes, but one that felt profoundly, unnervingly positive in its impact. It was the shape of a person, precisely, standing upright, arms at their sides, head held high, yet utterly, utterly empty. He found himself returning to the painting late into the evenings, long after the other researchers had departed. The fluorescent hum of the vault lights seemed to amplify the silence, and in that silence, the void seemed to deepen, to draw him in. He would trace its contours with his gaze, feeling a peculiar chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. It was a cerebral chill, a shiver of the mind, as if his perception itself were being subtly warped. The figures around the void, once so lively, now seemed to be frozen in a perpetual state of avoidance. Their painted eyes reflecting an unspoken dread of the emptiness they so carefully circumvented. One Tuesday, leaving the vault, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the university quad, Alistair experienced the first tremor of something truly disquieting. He was walking past a group of boisterous students, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone buildings. As he turned to navigate around them, a fleeting flicker at the edge of his vision. It was a shape, indistinct, but unmistakably human-like, a momentary distortion in the vibrant tapestry of the world. It was gone before he could properly focus, a phantom limb of perception, but it left a faint, lingering impression, the impression of an absence. He dismissed it, of course. Eye strain, fatigue, the mind playing tricks after hours of intense concentration on a peculiar visual anomaly. He was an academic, a man of logic and evidence. Superstition had no place in his meticulously ordered world. Yet, the image of the void in the painting, so stark and absolute, had begun to imprint itself upon his subconscious. Days turned into weeks. The sensation returned. It was always in his peripheral vision, always fleeting, always just beyond the reach of direct scrutiny. In the crowded university library, as he reached for a dusty tome on Flemish portraiture, he saw it again. A ripple in the air, a momentary blankness in the bustling rows of students, a person-shaped hole in the fabric of reality, just at the edge of his right eye. He spun, his heart giving a sudden, unpleasant lurch, but there was nothing, only the gentle rustle of turning pages and the hushed murmurs of academic pursuit. He started to become hyper-aware of his surroundings, his gaze constantly sweeping the edges of his visual field. The world, once a rich and detailed canvas, now felt like a potential trap, a place where the familiar could suddenly give way to the terrifying unknown. He found himself avoiding crowds, preferring the quiet solitude of his apartment or the empty corridors of the university after hours. The irony was not lost on him. The very subject of his study, the negative space, was now manifesting as a negative space in his own life, a growing void in his social interactions. The appearances grew bolder. No longer mere flickers, they held for a fraction of a second longer, allowing his mind to register their form with chilling clarity. He was at a cafe, sipping lukewarm tea, when it happened again. He was looking out the window at the busy street, the flow of pedestrians, the passing cars, the vibrant chaos of urban life. And then there it was, just beyond the frame of his vision, a distinct, human-shaped silhouette, darker than the shadows, yet not a shadow at all. It was an absence of light, an absence of form, a perfect void against the backdrop of a red brick building. It seemed to lean slightly, as if observing him. He dropped his teacup. The ceramic shattered on the floor, drawing startled glances from the few other patrons. He didn't care. His breath caught in his throat, a cold knot of fear tightening in his chest. He rubbed his eyes, blinked hard, but the image was seared into his mind. It was the exact shape of the void in Van der Velde's painting. Alistair began to keep a journal, meticulously documenting each sighting. The date, the time, the location, the specific angle of his vision, the surrounding environment. He tried to find patterns, correlations. Was it stress? Lack of sleep? A neurological condition? He even considered consulting a doctor, but the thought of trying to explain person-shaped blind spots filled him with a profound sense of futility and embarrassment. Who would believe him? They would simply attribute it to overwork, to a mind too deeply immersed in its subject. His research on Van der Velde became frantic. He scoured archives for any mention of the artist's eccentricities, his mental state, any unusual patrons or commissions. He found nothing. Van der Velde was a competent, if unremarkable, painter, known for his straightforward portraits and genre scenes. The group portrait with absence, as Alistair had privately titled it, remained a singular anomaly in his oeuvre. The dread became a constant companion. It was no longer just a fleeting sensation, but a pervasive anxiety that hummed beneath the surface of his every waking moment. He felt perpetually watched, not by eyes, but by an emptiness. He started to see the void not just in crowds, but in quieter moments too. Standing in his kitchen, making coffee, he'd glance towards the hallway and catch it. A silent, unmoving sentinel just beyond the doorframe. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he'd perceive it at the foot of his bed. A dark, formless sentinel against the pale wall. It was always just out of reach, always at the very edge of his central vision. He tested it. He would fix his gaze on a point, then consciously try to shift his attention to the void without moving his eyes. It was impossible. The moment he attempted to bring it into focus, it would vanish, dissolving back into the background, leaving behind only the lingering chill of its presence. It was like trying to catch smoke in his bare hands. The negative space, as he now thought of it, was getting closer. He could feel it. The initial sightings had been distant, almost imperceptible. Now, it felt as though it was standing right beside him, just a hair's breadth away from entering his direct line of sight. The air around it seemed to grow colder, heavier. He could almost feel its non-presence, a pressure against his skin that wasn't there. His colleagues noticed his decline. His once sharp intellect was now clouded by an almost manic obsession. He spoke of the painting, with an intensity that bordered on the fanatical, his explanations becoming increasingly convoluted, hinting at forces beyond the purely aesthetic. He started to neglect his other duties, his lectures becoming disjointed, his papers left unfinished. Whispers followed him through the university halls, murmurs of a breakdown, of a mind unraveling under the weight of its own esoteric pursuits. He stopped answering calls, stopped checking emails. His apartment became his sanctuary and his prison. The painting, which he had arranged to have temporarily moved to a private viewing room for his exclusive study, was his only companion. He would sit for hours, staring at the void, trying to understand its nature, its purpose. Was it a portal, a curse, a warning? The most terrifying thought, the one that truly gnawed at his sanity, was the idea that the void was not merely an absence, but a hunger for presence. And that if it ever fully entered his central field of vision, if he ever truly saw it, he would not see what it was, but rather, he would become what it was. He would become the absence. He would become the negative space. One night, the fear reached its zenith. He was in the viewing room, the painting illuminated before him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart. He had been staring at the void for hours, his eyes aching, his mind a whirlwind of terror and morbid fascination. He felt its presence, closer than ever before. It was just to his left, almost brushing his shoulder. He could feel the cold, the emptiness, a palpable pressure against his skin. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was waiting for him to turn his head, to shift his gaze, to allow it to fully enter his central vision. The temptation was overwhelming, a perverse desire to confront the unknown, to finally understand. But the terror was greater. The terror of becoming nothing, of being erased, of having his very existence replaced by a void. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to push the sensation away, to banish the creeping dread. He counted to 10, then 20, then 100, his breath ragged, shallow. When he finally opened his eyes, the room was still, the painting still, the void in the canvas still. But he knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was still there, just beyond the edge of his sight, waiting. He never returned to the university. His apartment became his tomb. He lived in a perpetual state of averted gaze, his head slightly turned, his eyes always scanning the periphery, never quite meeting the world head-on. Every shadow, every fleeting movement, every empty space in a room sent a jolt of ice through his veins. He was a man living on the edge of his own perception, forever haunted by the shape of what was not there. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake with a gasp, convinced that it had finally breached the barrier, that it was standing over him, its emptiness consuming the very air he breathed. He would lie there, rigid with fear, until the first faint light of dawn filtered through his curtains, pushing back the shadows, and with them, the terrifying certainty of the negative space. He was still Dr. Alistair Finch, the art historian, but he was also something else now. He was a man who understood absence, not as a lack, but as a presence that had taken root in his mind and perhaps was slowly, inexorably, consuming his very being, one peripheral glance at a time. And he knew, with a chilling finality, that the painting was not merely a work of art, but a mirror reflecting a truth too terrifying to behold directly, a truth that waited patiently, just beyond the edge of sight, for its moment to claim its next, willing or unwilling, void. Seventh story, the Souvenir. The stale air of the airplane still clung to him, a phantom scent of recycled oxygen and distant lands. Arthur dragged his suitcase through the front door of his apartment. The familiar click of the lock, a small comfort after weeks of unfamiliar hotel rooms and bustling foreign streets. He was home. The solo trip, a long-planned escape to clear his head, had been a whirlwind of ancient ruins, vibrant markets, and quiet moments of introspection. Now, the quiet hum of his refrigerator felt louder than any city square he traversed. Unpacking was always a chore, a necessary evil after the adventure. He unzipped the main compartment of his large duffel bag, pulling out crumpled clothes, a half-empty tube of sunscreen, and a guidebook dog-eared at the pages for obscure historical sites. Beneath a stack of t-shirts he'd forgotten to wear, his fingers brushed against something hard, something smooth. He pulled it out. It was a small, carved wooden figurine, no more than 6 inches tall. Its form was abstract, almost skeletal, yet undeniably humanoid. Long, slender limbs flowed into a torso that seemed to ripple like water, culminating in a head that was little more than a smooth, featureless oval, save for 2 deeply carved, almond-shaped depressions where eyes might be. The wood was dark, almost black, with a faint, polished sheen. It felt cool to the touch, surprisingly heavy for its size. Arthur turned it over in his hand, a frown creasing his brow. He had no memory of buying this. None at all. He'd meticulously budgeted for souvenirs, opting for small, practical items like a local scarf, a few postcards, and a miniature replica of a famous landmark. This figurine was unlike anything he would have chosen. It wasn't a tourist trinket. It felt older, more deliberate. Perhaps it was a gift, but from whom? He'd traveled alone, deliberately avoiding prolonged interaction. He'd certainly never been given anything like this. A fleeting thought suggested he might have picked it up in a sleepy, forgotten market stall during a moment of exhaustion, a half-conscious purchase. It was charming, in a strange, unsettling way. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the lines flowing with an almost organic grace. He found himself drawn to its smooth, cool surface, dismissing the momentary lapse in memory as post-travel fatigue. He decided it was a unique find. It would look good on his bedside table, a quirky memento of his journey. He placed it there, next to his alarm clock, its dark, silent form a new sentinel in his familiar room. The next morning, the jet lag was still a thick fog in his mind, but a strong coffee helped. He decided to sort through his digital photos, eager to relive the highlights of his trip and share them with friends later. He scrolled through hundreds of images, ancient temples bathed in golden light, bustling street scenes, panoramic vistas from mountain peaks. Each click brought a wave of nostalgia, a warm glow of satisfaction. Then he stopped. It was a photo taken on his second day, in front of the grand cathedral in the city center. He remembered the moment perfectly. The morning sun warm on his face, the pigeons cooing around his feet, the sense of exhilaration at being truly free. In the photo, he was standing, arm outstretched, a wide, genuine smile on his face, the cathedral's ornate facade soaring behind him. But that wasn't what he saw now. Man in the photo was him unmistakably, but his expression was wrong. The wide smile was gone, replaced by a somber, almost vacant look. His eyes, usually bright with curiosity, were dull, shadowed. His mouth was a thin, straight line. It wasn't a grimace, it was an absence of emotion, a blankness that chilled him. He stared at the image, then back at his own reflection in the dark screen of his phone. Had he really looked like that? No, he remembered smiling. He remembered the joy. He knew he had smiled. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in his photographic memory. Perhaps he'd taken 2 photos, one smiling, one serious, and uploaded the wrong one. He scrolled on, a faint tremor of unease beginning to ripple beneath his composure. The tremor intensified with the next image. This one was from a crowded market, a vibrant tapestry of colors and faces. He remembered taking it, trying to capture the chaotic energy of the place. In the background, a man with a distinctive red scarf was haggling over a rug. Arthur remembered him clearly, a fleeting part of the scenery. Now that man was staring, not just looking in the general direction of the camera, but staring directly at him, at Arthur, through the lens. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to bore into Arthur's own, a silent, unnerving gaze that transcended the digital frame. And the man wasn't haggling. His hands were clasped in front of him, motionless, his entire posture rigid, as if frozen in the act of observation. A shiver ran down Arthur's spine. He zoomed in, his thumb trembling slightly. The man's face was sharp, almost too defined, his features subtly wrong, like a mask that fit too perfectly. He scrolled back to the cathedral photo, then to the market photo, his gaze darting between them. The somber expression, the starring stranger. These weren't minor glitches. These were fundamental alterations. It was as if someone had taken his memories, his captured moments, and subtly, maliciously twisted them. Panic began to coil in his gut. He went through every single photo, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The changes were subtle at first, then increasingly blatant. A group of tourists he remembered laughing together now stood in grim silence. A street performer he tipped generously was now looking away, his face obscured by shadow. A vibrant mural he'd admired was now faded, almost monochrome. The colors of his trip, the joy, the vibrancy, seemed to be draining away, replaced by an insidious pallor. He felt a deep, chilling sense of wrongness, as if the very fabric of his past was unraveling. He remembered taking a selfie with a friendly street vendor, both of them beaming. Now, the vendor's face was blurred, indistinct, and Arthur's own smile was strained, almost fearful. He remembered the taste of a particular street food, the sound of a specific song drifting from a cafe. He tried to conjure these memories, to hold on to them, but they felt distant, like echoes in an empty hall. He could recall the fact of them, but the sensory details, the emotional resonance, were fading, replaced by a vague sense of unease. He felt a growing compulsion to verify everything. He pulled out his physical souvenirs, the scarf, the postcards, the miniature landmark. The scarf felt rougher than he remembered, its colors less vibrant. The postcards, which he distinctly recalled buying from a cheerful old woman near the main square, now seemed to have generic, mass-produced stamps. The miniature landmark, a replica of a famous tower, felt lighter, cheaper, somehow less significant than the cherished item he'd carefully wrapped and packed. He rifled through his travel documents, his passport, his flight tickets, his hotel reservations. Everything was there, seemingly untouched. But as he looked at the dates, the names of the hotels, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. He remembered booking a quaint boutique hotel, but the reservation now listed a large, impersonal chain. He remembered his return flight being in the evening, but the ticket clearly stated a morning departure. He had no memory of these discrepancies. His mind simply accepted the printed words as truth, even as a deeper, more primal part of him screamed that it was all wrong. He looked at his travel journal, a small leather-bound book where he jotted down observations and feelings. He flipped through the pages. His handwriting was there, undeniably his. But the entries, they were sparse, almost clinical. Descriptions of places, dates, times. Where were the reflections, the emotions, the vivid descriptions of the people he'd encountered, the small adventures he'd had? He remembered writing about a particularly humorous encounter with a street mime, a detailed account of a sunrise hike, a profound thought he'd had while sitting by a river. None of it was there. The journal was a skeletal outline of a trip, devoid of the life he remembered pouring into it. His gaze fell upon the small wooden figurine on his bedside table. It sat there, silent and still, its featureless face seeming to absorb the light, to drink in the growing terror in the room. The initial charm had vanished, replaced by a profound sense of dread. Its smooth, dark surface now seemed menacing, its abstract form less artistic and more predatory. A horrifying realization began to crystallize in his mind, slowly, inexorably, like ice forming on a dark pond. It wasn't just the photos, or the souvenirs, or the journal. It was his memories. They were being rewritten, edited, not just subtly, but fundamentally. The trip he remembered, the vibrant, joyful, introspective journey, was not the trip that had actually occurred. Or rather, it was the trip that had occurred. But it was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, to make way for something else. The figurine. It hadn't been a souvenir from his trip. That was the lie. That was the memory that had been inserted, carefully, seamlessly, to explain its presence. The truth was far more insidious, far more terrifying. The trip itself, the entire solo journey, was a consequence of the figurine. It was as if the figurine had orchestrated the journey, had woven the memories, had laid the groundwork for its own arrival. It had sent him away, perhaps to a place where such an object could be acquired, or perhaps simply to isolate him, to make him vulnerable to its influence. His memories weren't merely fading, they were being actively, methodically edited. The blank spaces in his journal, the somber expressions in his photos, the starring stranger, these weren't errors. They were deletions. They were the removal of what was, to make room for what would be. He picked up the figurine again. It felt heavier now, colder. The smooth, dark wood seemed to throb faintly in his palm. He looked into the almond-shaped depressions that served as its eyes. and for the first time, he felt as though something was looking back. Not with malice, not with anger, but with a cold, calculating patience. What was it making room for? What was this something else that required the systematic erasure of his past, the careful dismantling of his very identity? The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He was a canvas, and the figurine was the artist, meticulously scrubbing away the old painting to begin a new, terrifying masterpiece. He was no longer the traveler, the adventurer, the man who had sought solace in distant lands. He was merely the vessel, the empty space being prepared, and the preparation, he now understood with a chilling certainty, was far from over. The silent, featureless sentinel on his bedside table had only just begun its work. 8th story, the Sleep-Mender. It began subtly, a whisper of discomfort at the edges of my waking. A phantom ache in my left knee, as if I had twisted it badly in my sleep, though the night had been still and dreamless. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a lingering stiffness from an awkward sleeping position. But then, it returned the next morning, and the morning after that. Not the knee, but a dull throb in my shoulder, reminiscent of a bruise. Yet no discoloration marred my skin. Soon, these phantom injuries became a daily ritual, a macabre lottery of pain. One day, it would be the searing ghost of a burn across my forearm, the skin tingling with an invisible heat. The next, a deep, gnawing sensation in my lower back, as if I had fallen from a great height. Sometimes, a sharp, almost surgical sting would prick my fingertips, leaving no mark, only the memory of a cut that never was. I consulted doctors, of course. My general practitioner, then a neurologist, a rheumatologist, even a sleep specialist. They ran tests, endless blood panels, MRIs, nerve conduction studies. Each time, the results came back pristine, a testament to a body in perfect, if peculiar health. Psychosomatic, one suggested gently, prescribing mild antidepressants. Another hinted at stress, recommending mindfulness exercises. But I knew with an unsettling certainty that this was not in my head. The pain was too vivid, too specific, too varied. It felt like a physical echo, a residual sensation from a trauma that had occurred, just not to me. Each morning, I woke up feeling as if I had survived some unseen ordeal, my body a canvas for invisible wounds, only for them to fade by midday, leaving me exhausted and perplexed. My sleep, once a sanctuary, became a source of dread. What was happening to me in the depths of unconsciousness? Was I dreaming these injuries, or were they being inflicted upon some part of me, a part I couldn't perceive? The mystery gnawed at me, eroding my peace, turning my nights into a silent, terrifying question mark. Desperation, a cold and persistent companion, eventually led me down less conventional paths. I scoured obscure forums, delved into forgotten folklore, and devoured books on ancient remedies and spiritual ailments. It was in one such dusty tome, tucked away in a forgotten corner of an antique bookstore, that I stumbled upon a curious passage. It spoke of night menders, unseen entities that roamed the liminal spaces between worlds, burdened by their own ethereal wounds. It claimed that by offering them simple provisions, a bowl of fresh water, a clean, folded cloth, one could forge an unspoken pact. They would use the offerings to tend to their own unseen afflictions, and in return, They would mend the physical and spiritual ailments of their benefactor. The concept was absurd, a relic of a superstitious past. Yet, the sheer exhaustion, the relentless cycle of phantom pain, pushed me past skepticism. What did I have to lose? That night, with a tremor of both fear and foolish hope, I prepared the offering. I filled a small ceramic bowl with tap water, cool and clear, and placed it on my bedside table. Beside it, I carefully laid a freshly laundered linen cloth, folded into a neat square, its scent faintly of lavender from the fabric softener. The room felt charged, the air thick with unspoken anticipation. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house, the distant hum of the refrigerator. I waited, straining for any sound, any sign of a presence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. But nothing came. The hours crawled by, marked only by the slow, deliberate tick of my grandfather clock. Eventually, sleep, heavy and profound, claimed me. It was a sleep unlike any I had experienced in years. A deep, dreamless plunge into oblivion, devoid of the usual anxieties that clung to my nights. When I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the absence. The absence of pain, the absence of stiffness, the absence of that familiar, insidious ache that had greeted me every single morning for months. My body felt light, refreshed, as if I had truly rested for the first time in an age. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought tears to my eyes. Then, my gaze fell upon the bedside table. The bowl of water was no longer full. The water level had visibly dropped, perhaps by an inch or more, and a faint, almost imperceptible film shimmered on its surface, like dust motes caught in moonlight. The clean linen cloth was no longer pristine. It was damp, not soaked, but distinctly moist, and across its surface, a faint reddish-brown stain, like dried rust or old blood, marred the crisp white. It was small, no bigger than a thumbprint, and faded, but unmistakably there. My breath hitched. The absurdity of the folk practice collided with the undeniable evidence before my eyes. Something had been here. Something had used my offering. And in return, my body was whole. The routine became my new normal, a silent, nightly pact. Every evening before I retired, I would meticulously refill the ceramic bowl with fresh water and place a new, clean cloth beside it. And every morning, I would wake up free of pain, only to find the water level lowered, the cloth bearing a new, faint mark, sometimes a smudge of gray, like ash, other times a faint, oily residue, or that recurring reddish stain. The marks were never the same, never overtly alarming, just enough to confirm the nightly visitation. I never saw it, never heard it. No creak of the floorboards, no rustle of fabric, no whisper of breath. Yet, its presence became as real to me as the air I breathed. It was a silent, nocturnal partner, a phantom physician tending to its own wounds in the dark, and in doing so, mending mine. The intimacy of it was unsettling. This unknown entity was in my most private space, sharing my room, interacting with my possessions, performing a ritual that directly impacted my physical well-being. It knew me, in a way, through the daily exchange, even if I knew nothing of it. Sometimes, I would try to stay awake, to catch a glimpse, to understand. I'd lie perfectly still, feigning sleep, my eyes barely slits, my breathing shallow. The room would remain silent, utterly still. But then, an overwhelming sense of drowsiness would descend upon me, a profound, almost unnatural lethargy that would drag me down into the deepest sleep imaginable, a sleep from which there was no resisting. It was as if the entity, whatever it was, possessed a subtle, potent influence over my consciousness, ensuring its privacy. I tried setting up a motion-activated camera once, a small, discreet device. The next morning, the camera was off, its battery drained, though it had been fully charged when I placed it. It was a clear message. My nocturnal visitor desired anonymity. This only deepened the mystery, adding another layer to the unnerving intimacy of our arrangement. Was it shy? Or was it something that could not, or would not, be seen by human eyes? The implications of this strange transaction began to consume my thoughts during the day. What kind of being was this that bore such constant, shifting injuries? Was it a creature of flesh and blood, existing on some parallel plane, its wounds bleeding through into my reality? Or was it something ethereal, a spirit, a fragment of a lost soul, its pain a reflection of some ancient suffering? The marks on the cloth, though faint, hinted at a physicality, a tangible interaction with the water and fabric. Was it suffering? Was it in constant torment, and my offerings provided a brief, nightly respite? The thought evoked a strange mix of pity and fear. I was helping it, yes, but what was it? And what was the true cost of this healing? The more I pondered, the more the line between benefactor and dependent blurred. I was no longer just the recipient of its strange mercy. I was also its unwitting caregiver, providing the means for its nightly mending. Most terrifying question, the one that truly haunted my waking hours, was, what happens if I stop? What if I decide one night not to leave the bowl of water and the clean cloth? Would the phantom pains return, perhaps with greater intensity, a punishment for breaking the pact? Or would something far worse occur? Would the entity, deprived of its nightly solace, become angry, its unseen presence turning from benign mender to malevolent force? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I was trapped, bound by an unspoken agreement to an unknown entity. My relief from pain came at the price of an eternal, unsettling obligation. The dependence was absolute. I could not risk the return of the injuries, nor could I risk the wrath of something that had demonstrated such subtle, yet undeniable, power over my sleep and my surroundings. One morning, the mark on the cloth was different. Instead of the usual faint stain or smudge, there was a tiny, almost imperceptible tear, a single thread pulled loose, as if something had snagged it. And the water, while still lowered, had a faint, sweet scent, like damp earth after a summer rain. Or perhaps something even more organic, something alive. It was a subtle shift, but it unnerved me profoundly. It suggested a change, a slight escalation in the interaction, as if the entity was becoming more substantial, or perhaps more comfortable in my space. Was it healing more effectively? Or was it merely a sign of its growing presence, its ethereal body solidifying just enough to leave a more distinct impression? I held the cloth to my nose, inhaling the strange, sweet odor, a scent that was both alien and oddly comforting, like a secret shared in the dead of night. And so the ritual continues. Every evening, the bowl of water, the clean cloth. Every morning, the absence of pain, the subtle evidence of a nocturnal visitor. I am forever bound to this unseen sleep-mender, a silent partner in a transaction I barely comprehend. It brings me peace, but at what cost? The horror is not in a monstrous apparition, but in the quiet, inescapable intimacy of the unknown. It is in the knowledge that something shares my nights, tends to its own wounds in the dark, and in doing so, keeps my body whole. And I can never stop. I can never truly know who or what lies beyond the veil of my deepest sleep, visiting my room, touching my things. A silent, suffering presence whose very existence is now inextricably linked to my own well-being. The mystery remains, a constant, chilling whisper in the quiet hours before dawn, a question that will likely never be answered. Ninth story, the last station. The rhythmic sway of the subway car had always been my lullaby after a long day. It was a familiar comfort, the gentle rocking motion combined with the low hum of the tracks, a promise of home and the soft embrace of sleep. Tonight was no different. The late hour meant the car was mostly empty, a blessing after the sardine can crush of rush hour. I remember settling into the worn plastic seat, my head lolling against the cool window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color as the train pulled away from my usual stop. One more station, I thought, just one more, and then the transfer, and then nothing. Just the deep, inviting darkness. The jolt that brought me back was not violent, but rather a sudden, unsettling cessation of the familiar rhythm. It was as if the train had abruptly decided to glide on silk, the usual clatter and rumble replaced by an almost unnerving smoothness. My eyes snapped open, blinking against the dim, diffused light of the car. The first thing I registered was the silence. Not the quiet hum of a moving train, but a profound, almost absolute stillness. It pressed in, thick and heavy, absorbing any stray sound. My own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in my ears, a ragged whisper against the quiet. I sat upright, a prickle of unease tracing its way up my spine. The car was, as expected for this late hour, largely deserted, but not entirely. My gaze swept across the rows of seats, and that's when I saw them. There were 3 others. 1 woman, 2 men. Each occupied a seat a few rows ahead of me, spaced out, not together. They sat perfectly still, their forms rigid, facing straight ahead. Their hands rested in their laps, or clutched bags, or simply hung at their sides. There was no movement, no fidgeting, no casual glance at a phone. Their stillness was absolute, a frozen tableau. And they were silent, utterly, profoundly silent. No cough, no sigh, no rustle of clothing. It was as if they were statues, or perhaps simply waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't say. My eyes drifted to the windows. This was the second thing that solidified the growing dread in my stomach. Outside, there was nothing. No flickering tunnel lights, no fleeting glimpses of concrete walls, no emergency exits marked with glowing signs. Only an inky, featureless black. It was a blackness so profound it seemed to absorb light, rather than merely reflect its absence. It wasn't the dark of a tunnel. It was the dark of an abyss, a void. It stretched endlessly, without texture or depth. A perfect, seamless curtain drawn across the world. The train was moving. I could feel the subtle forward momentum, the gentle sway, but it was moving through nothing, through absolute, impenetrable nullity. A cold knot tightened in my chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't the subway. The last train, yes, but not this last train. My heart began to thrum a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the car. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt dry, constricted. Then the familiar, automated voice of the subway announcer cut through the stillness. It was the same calm, slightly synthesized female voice that had guided me through countless commutes, the voice that announced delays and upcoming stops. But what it said now resonated with a chilling clarity that pierced the quiet. The next stop, the voice intoned, its usual inflection slightly elongated, a subtle, almost imperceptible echo clinging to the words, is the water's edge. The water's edge. My mind scrambled, searching through the mental map of the city's transit system. There was no such station, not on any line. I knew every stop, every transfer point, every obscure little platform. The water's edge was not among them. The words hung in the air, a strange, poetic menace. What water? What edge? My gaze flickered to the other passengers. Not a single head turned, not a single muscle twitched. They remained fixed, staring ahead, as if the announcement was perfectly normal, perfectly expected. A tremor ran through me. I wanted to call out, to ask them, to demand an explanation. But the words caught in my throat. The silence was too heavy, their stillness too absolute. It felt as though any sound I made would shatter something fragile, irrevocably altering the strange, unsettling balance of the car. So I remained silent, my breath shallow, my eyes darting between the unmoving figures and the impenetrable blackness beyond the glass. The train continued its smooth, silent journey. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The lack of any visual reference outside made time feel elastic, meaningless. Was it moving fast? Slow? I couldn't tell. The only indication of motion was the almost imperceptible hum beneath the floor and the gentle, continuous sway. Then the voice returned. This time, it was accompanied by a faint, almost subliminal chime, a sound that usually preceded a station announcement. But here, it felt like a prelude to something far more profound. Mind the gap, the voice began, its tone unwavering. Between what you are and what you were. My breath hitched. The words were a direct address, a chilling philosophical pronouncement delivered with the mundane cadence of a transit warning. Mind the gap, the physical gap between the platform and the train, a common warning. But this was different. A gap not of space, but of being. What I was and what I were. The grammatical shift, the subtle alteration, was deeply unsettling. It implied a change, a transition, a severance. Was this journey meant to bridge that gap or widen it? Was I already somewhere else, irrevocably altered by this silent, endless ride? Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I felt a desperate urge to reach for my phone, to check the time, to see a familiar screen, to connect with anything real. My hand fumbled in my pocket, but then I stopped. What would I do? Call for help? To whom? And what would I say? I'm on a subway that's not a subway, going to a place that doesn't exist, with silent strangers, and the announcer is speaking in riddles. It sounded like the ramblings of a fever dream. I looked at the other passengers again. Their faces were indistinct in the dim light, shadowed by the overhead fixtures. They weren't sleeping. Their eyes, though I couldn't make them out clearly, felt open, fixed. Were they seeing the same blackness, hearing the same announcements? Were they as terrified as I was, or had they already crossed that gap, becoming something other than what they were? The train maintained its unwavering speed, its journey through the void unbroken. There was no deceleration, no hint of an approaching station. The water's edge. It sounded like a final destination, a place of no return. And the gap between my past self, the one who fell asleep on a mundane subway, and this new self, trapped in this surreal, unending transit. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. A dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the cold plastic of the seat beneath me, the faint, metallic scent in the air, the undeniable sensation of forward motion. It all felt too real, too tangible. This was not a dream. This was a waking nightmare, a quiet, insidious terror that crept into your bones without a single scream. The automated voice returned, its tone still calm, still unhurried. "The next stop," it announced, the words resonating with a strange, hollow echo, "is the Whispering Gallery." The Whispering Gallery. Another non-existent station, another name that conjured images of liminal spaces, of secrets and echoes. My breath hitched again. What would whisper there? The voices of those who had crossed the gap, the forgotten memories of what I were. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to stand, a sudden, desperate urge to move, to break the spell of stillness. My legs felt heavy, as if weighted down by an invisible force. I pushed against the seat, struggling to rise, but found myself strangely rooted. It wasn't a physical restraint, but a profound, almost spiritual inertia. A sense that movement was futile, that my place was here, in this seat, on this train, on this unending journey. The other passengers remained unmoved, oblivious to my silent struggle. Their stoic presence was both a comfort and a terror. A comfort because I was not alone. A terror because they offered no solace, no shared understanding, only a reflection of my own trapped state. Hours must have passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had ceased to have meaning in the featureless blackness. The announcements came at irregular intervals, each one a new riddle, a new layer of dread. "Please stand clear of the closing doors," the voice intoned once, but no doors opened, no light appeared, no platform materialized. It was a cruel mockery, a reminder of the escape that would never come. "The journey continues," it added, almost as an afterthought, "into the deep, into the deep." The words painted a vivid picture in my mind, an endless descent, a plunge into the unknown. The train, my silent carriage, was taking me deeper and deeper into this void, away from everything familiar, everything real. I thought of my life, of the mundane routines, the small joys, the frustrations. They felt distant now, like memories from another lifetime. The gap between what I was and what I were felt wider with every passing moment, every unsettling announcement. The air in the car was cool, almost sterile. There was no dust motes dancing in the light, no faint smell of ozone or stale air. It was perfectly clean, perfectly still. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting an even, unchanging glow on the empty seats and the silent figures. It was a pristine, terrifying environment, a perfect machine carrying its passengers to an unknown fate. Another announcement. This one was different, shorter, more direct, yet infinitely more chilling. Arrival, the voice stated, with a finality that made my blood run cold. Destination, undetermined. Arrival, but where? And if the destination was undetermined, then what was the purpose of this arrival? Was it merely the end of one phase of the journey, only to begin another? The thought was a fresh wave of despair. There was no disembarking, only a transition. My gaze was drawn back to the windows. The blackness remained absolute, unbroken. There was no hint of light, no promise of a world beyond this endless void. The train continued its smooth, unwavering glide, a phantom vessel on an unseen track. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the unsettling reality, to force myself back into the comforting dream of a normal subway ride. But the hum of the train, the subtle sway, the memory of the voice, they were all too real. When I opened my eyes again, nothing had changed. The silent passengers, the black void, the unending journey. Profound sense of calm began to settle over me, a strange, terrifying acceptance. What else was there to do? There was no escape, no fight, no plea. Only the quiet, serene dread of a journey without end, a final ride from which you cannot disembark. This was the last station, not a place, but a state of being. And I was on the last train, carrying me deeper into the unknown, minding the ever-widening gap between what I was and what I were. The smooth, silent ride continued, and I, along with the other silent passengers, simply stared ahead, waiting for the next announcement, waiting for the undetermined destination. The hum of the train was my only companion, a constant, low thrum against the profound silence of the void. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was my final journey, an unending passage into the black. 10th story, my childhood rocking chair. New apartment was a blank canvas, bright with possibility. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, promising a fresh start. After years of transient living, of temporary leases and borrowed furniture, this place felt like an anchor. It was small, yes, but it was mine, and the quiet hum of the city outside was a lullaby, not a cacophony. I wanted to fill it with things that felt like home, pieces of my past that could ground me in this new chapter. And so, the first item on my list was a pilgrimage to my parents' attic. It was a place of forgotten treasures and lingering dust, a repository of family history. Cardboard boxes, brittle with age, were stacked precariously, filled with relics of childhoods long past. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and cedar. And there, tucked away in a shadowy corner, beneath a moth-eaten tapestry and a stack of yellowed newspapers, it sat. My rocking chair. It wasn't grand or ornate. In fact, it was rather simple, crafted from a dark, unassuming wood. Its finish worn smooth in places where countless small hands had gripped its arms. The seat was upholstered in a faded, floral fabric, a pattern I could still trace from memory, even though the colors had softened into muted tones over the decades. It was the chair my mother had rocked me in as an infant, the chair I had later claimed as my own, spending countless hours nestled within its embrace, lost in books, or simply staring out the window, dreaming. It was a silent witness to my formative years, a constant, comforting presence. Retrieving it was more of a challenge than I anticipated. It was heavier than it looked, solid and unyielding. My father, with a grunt and a chuckle about old wood holding its secrets, helped me maneuver it down the narrow attic stairs and into the back of my borrowed SUV. The journey back to the city felt significant, like I was transporting a piece of my very soul. Once in my apartment, I chose the perfect spot for it, by the largest window in the living room, where the afternoon sun would bathe it in a warm glow. I dusted it carefully, running my fingers over the familiar curves of the armrests, feeling the slight give of the aged springs beneath the cushion. It settled into its new home with a quiet dignity, a silent sentinel in my burgeoning sanctuary. Just having it there made the apartment feel less empty, more lived in, more truly mine. It was a tangible link to a simpler time, a source of quiet comfort in the bustling newness of my adult life. I would often sit in it, letting its gentle rhythm soothe me after a long day. The familiar creak of the runners, a comforting counterpoint to the city's distant hum. It was more than just furniture. It was a memory, a feeling, a piece of my history made manifest. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a draft, or perhaps just my imagination. I had just received fantastic news at work. A project I had poured months into had been approved, with high praise from the executives. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated elation, a lightness that made me want to skip down the hallway. I called my best friend, practically bubbling over with excitement, sharing every detail, every triumphant moment. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when I finally hung up, a wide, genuine smile was plastered across my face. I felt utterly, completely happy. I walked into the living room, still basking in the afterglow of success and shared joy. That's when I saw it. The rocking chair sitting by the window was swaying gently. Not a violent, sudden movement, but a slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic rock, as if someone had just risen from its seat. The room was still, the window closed, no discernible breeze. My initial thought was a curious flicker of surprise, followed by a rational explanation. Perhaps I had bumped it earlier, and it was just settling. I watched it for a moment, the faint creak of its runners echoing in the quiet room, before it slowly, almost imperceptibly, came to a halt. I shrugged, still smiling, and went to make myself a celebratory cup of tea. The incident, though odd, was quickly forgotten in the haze of my good mood. A few weeks later, it happened again. This time, it was after a truly wonderful first date. We had laughed easily, the conversation flowing effortlessly, and there was a spark, a genuine connection I hadn't felt in a long time. Walking back to my apartment, the city lights seemed to twinkle brighter, the air felt crisper, and my heart felt full, buoyant with a hopeful excitement. I was practically humming with contentment. I unlocked my door, still replaying snippets of the evening in my mind, a soft, contented sigh escaping my lips. As I stepped into the living room, my gaze instinctively drifted to the rocking chair, And there it was, rocking. Slowly, steadily, back and forth, back and forth. The same gentle, silent motion as before. This time, there was no logical explanation. The apartment had been empty since I left for the date hours ago. No drafts, no bumps. I stood in the doorway, watching it. A faint prickle of unease beginning to form at the back of my neck. It continued its silent dance for perhaps 30 seconds before gradually, almost reluctantly, slowing to a stop. This time I didn't dismiss it as easily. I walked over to it, my brow furrowed, and ran my hand over the smooth wood of its armrest. It felt cool, inanimate, just a chair. Yet it had moved, and it had moved after a moment of profound happiness. The thought was fleeting, a strange coincidence, nothing more. Still, a tiny seed of curiosity, tinged with a nascent apprehension, had been planted. I told myself it was just an old house settling, or perhaps the vibrations from a passing truck. Anything to avoid the unsettling implication. The pattern, however, became undeniable. It was subtle at first, easily overlooked amidst the everyday ebb and flow of life. But once I started looking, once that tiny seed of apprehension began to sprout, it became impossible to ignore. There was the afternoon I received a heartfelt email from an old friend, apologizing for a past misunderstanding and expressing their desire to reconnect. A wave of warmth washed over me, a feeling of reconciliation and renewed connection. I felt a deep, quiet joy. Later that evening, as I walked from the kitchen to the living room, a glass of water in hand, I saw the chair rocking. Just a few gentle swings, almost imperceptible if you weren't looking for it, before it settled. And there was the weekend I spent volunteering at an animal shelter. Helping the abandoned animals, seeing their timid eyes light up with affection, brought me a pure, selfless happiness. I returned home exhausted, but deeply fulfilled. The moment I stepped through my door, a faint creak caught my attention. The rocking chair, in the dim light of the living room, was swaying. It seemed to sway with a little more vigor this time, a slightly wider arc, before slowly coming to rest. It was always after these moments. Not just any happiness, but genuine, deeply felt happiness. The kind that made your chest ache with its sweetness. The kind that made you feel truly alive, truly connected to the world. A successful presentation at work. A spontaneous burst of laughter with a loved one. The simple pleasure of a perfect cup of coffee on a sunny morning. Each time, without fail, if I left the room and returned shortly after, the chair would be rocking. The initial dismissals gave way to a creeping unease. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't my imagination. It was the chair, and it was reacting to my joy. The thought, once absurd, now felt cold and solid in my mind. The more I observed, the more the pattern solidified into an unsettling truth. But then, a new, more insidious observation began to surface. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the rocking itself. After each instance of profound happiness, after each time the chair silently swayed in its wake, I would feel a hollowness. It wasn't immediate. The initial burst of joy would still be vibrant. But as the hours passed, or sometimes even within minutes of witnessing the chair's silent dance, that vibrant feeling would begin to dissipate. It wasn't just the natural fading of excitement. It was a draining, a leaching. The joy I had felt, so potent and real, would leave behind an echo, a faint imprint, but the substance of it would be gone. I would feel emotionally depleted, as if a vital energy had been siphoned away. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the natural come down after a high. The body and mind simply couldn't sustain such intense positive emotions indefinitely. But the feeling was too specific, too consistent. It wasn't just a gentle descent. It was a sudden drop, a vacuum where the warmth had been. My elation would turn into a dull ache, my contentment into a vague restlessness. I would find myself staring blankly, feeling strangely flat, the memory of the joy a distant, almost abstract concept. The more I noticed the rocking, the more I noticed the subsequent emptiness. It was as if the chair was not merely reacting to my happiness, but consuming it. The thought was grotesque, a chilling whisper in the quiet of my apartment. Could this beloved, comforting object, this relic of my childhood, be something else entirely? Something parasitic. The idea was horrifying. I tried to push it away, to convince myself it was a delusion born of stress or overwork. But the evidence, though circumstantial, was piling up. Each instance a tiny, cold stone added to a growing cairn of dread. I began to actively test it, a morbid curiosity overriding my fear. I would seek out moments of unbridled joy. I planned a surprise visit to my elderly aunt, knowing her delight would be infectious. As she hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes, I felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated love. I lingered for a moment, savoring the feeling, then made an excuse to step into the hallway, just out of her sight. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and then re-entered the living room. The chair was rocking, faster than I had ever seen it, a vigorous, almost hungry sway. It creaked louder, a rhythmic, grinding sound that filled the silent apartment. I watched it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. It rocked and rocked, a silent, relentless devourer. And as it rocked, I felt it. The joy, the warmth, the love I had just felt for my aunt began to recede, like water draining from a tub. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was a swift, undeniable suction. By the time the chair slowed to a halt, its creaks dying into silence, I was left with a profound, aching emptiness. The visit, so full of warmth moments before, felt distant, almost meaningless. I felt hollowed out, a mere shell of the person who had walked through that door. The confirmation was devastating. The chair wasn't just a quirky, haunted object. It was a living, feeding thing, and its sustenance was my happiness. The very comfort it had offered, the sense of peace it had always provided, was a cruel deception, a lure. It had been drawing me in, lulling me into a false sense of security, all while silently, patiently, devouring the most precious part of my emotional landscape. The true horror, the one that truly chilled me to the bone, was the realization that followed. The chair had been with me since childhood, since infancy. My mother had rocked me in it. I had spent countless hours in its embrace, growing up. How many moments of pure, unadulterated childish glee had been absorbed by its silent hunger. How many innocent bursts of joy. How many carefree laughs. How many moments of simple, unburdened happiness had been siphoned away, leaving behind a subtle, lingering void. I began to re-examine my past. Every memory filtered through this new, terrifying lens. My childhood, which I had always remembered as generally happy, now seemed tinged with a strange, inexplicable melancholy. There were moments, vivid in my mind, where I recalled feeling an intense surge of joy. The day I got my first bicycle, the excitement of Christmas morning, the thrill of a perfect summer day. But then, almost immediately, a vague sense of letdown, a quiet sadness, would follow. I had always attributed it to the natural ebb and flow of emotions, the fleeting nature of happiness. But what if it wasn't? What if it was the chair? What if it had been doing this my entire life? What if the reason I sometimes struggled to hold on to joy, to truly bask in its warmth, was because this seemingly innocuous object had been systematically draining it from me, leaving me perpetually a little less full, a little less vibrant than I should have been. The thought was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut. It wasn't just a parasitic object. It was a parasitic companion, one that had been with me from my earliest days, shaping my very capacity for happiness. I looked at the chair now, sitting by the window, bathed in the afternoon sun, its floral fabric faded, its wood worn smooth. It looked so innocent, so benign. But I saw it differently. I saw a silent predator, a patient, insatiable entity that had been feeding on my most precious resource, leaving me emotionally impoverished without my even knowing it. The comfort it had once offered now felt like a suffocating embrace, a trap. What could I do? Destroy it, burn it, throw it away. The thought of harming something that had been such an integral part of my life, even now, felt like an act of betrayal. And what if its influence wasn't bound by its physical presence? What if the years of absorption had left an indelible mark on my very soul, a permanent susceptibility to emotional drainage? I tried to avoid it, to simply not sit in it. But its presence in the living room was a constant, mocking reminder. Every time I felt a flicker of genuine happiness, my eyes would dart to it, expecting, dreading its silent, hungry sway. And even when I didn't sit in it, even when I tried to keep my distance, the pattern persisted. The joy would come, a brief, brilliant flash, and then, inevitably, the chair would rock. A slow, gentle, almost imperceptible motion, like a contented sigh. And with each sway, a piece of me, a piece of my happiness, would vanish, leaving behind that familiar, desolate void. I am still here in this apartment with the rocking chair. It sits by the window, an unchanging, unmoving presence. But it is always there, a silent sentinel, waiting for my happiness. And I am always here, watching it, feeling the slow, insidious drain of my own joy. The silence of its rocking is the most terrifying sound I know, a whisper of what it has taken, and what it will continue to take, forever. The comfort it once offered has become a chilling testament to its parasitic nature, a constant, quiet horror that rocks me gently into a perpetual state of emotional depletion. Conclusion, and for those of you still with me, still floating here in the dark, the night is at its deepest. I'm curious. Of all the accounts you heard this evening, which one settled deepest into your mind? Let me know in the comments. Let that thought be your final anchor as you drift away. Until next time, sleep well and listen closely.